I've heard some atheists say, oh, so Jesus just had a bad weekend. This kind of thing. Now, I don't mean to be flippant about this, but I would say, oh, you think it was just a bad weekend? What if we did that to you? Right?
Yeah.
What if we whipped you? What if we nailed you to a cross? What if we put you through the whole situation and then you rose from the dead on Sunday morning? Would you still say the same thing after that? Oh, it's just a bad weekend, but I'm fine now. You go, that was awful.
If Jesus knew he would rise again in 3 days, does that make his suffering less significant? Thinking face, some argue that his sacrifice was easy because it was temporary, just 3 days of suffering in exchange for eternal glory. But is this a fair argument? In this video, Frank Turk answers a challenging question about Jesus' suffering and whether it was truly a sacrifice. But does his answer fully address the weight of what Christ endured? Make sure to watch until the end. This is one of the most important theological questions you'll ever hear. Let's discuss in the comments. Backhand index pointing down, fire.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Jack.
Hey, Jack.
My grandma taught me, Matthew might mean God's gift. My grandma taught me that Jack means to lift up a car.
Jack means to lift up a car.
That's what she said, yes.
And when you go flying, nobody can say hi to you.
No, I've had trouble with that. Anyway, the question I have is
Some of you will get that tomorrow. Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
The question I have is actually one that a friend of mine asked me, and I didn't really have a good answer for him. His thought process was basically that if Jesus knew that he was going to rise from death after 3 days, that his sacrifice was kind of easy because it was temporary. And so his question was sort of, how does temporary suffering return eternal salvation?
Because Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. He had two natures.
Yeah.
Now, his divine nature did not die on the cross, but his human nature did. So he is the perfect sacrifice. He has to have 1 foot on each side of the divide, God and man. So it wasn't just the physical suffering that he took on himself, but the emotional suffering. My God, why have you forsaken me? You know, the only place that Jesus calls his Father, my God, is when he's on the cross. He's quoting for what, Psalm 22 or 16? One of the two. I think it's Psalm 22, right? So it wasn't just the physical suffering, it was the emotional suffering as well. Also, I've heard some atheists say, oh, so Jesus just had a bad weekend. This kind of thing. Now, I don't mean to be flippant about this, but I would say, oh, you think it was just a bad weekend? What if we did that to you? Right?
Yeah.
What if we whipped you? What if we nailed you to a cross? What if we put you through the whole situation and then you rose from the dead on Sunday morning? Would you still say the same thing after that? Oh, it's just a bad weekend, but I'm fine now. You go, that was awful. Never want to do that again, right? So it's not just physical, it's also spiritual and emotional.
Thank you.
All right. God bless. Thanks.
Frank Turk provides a solid response, emphasizing that Jesus' suffering was more than just physical. It was also emotional and spiritual. However, there are several areas that need deeper exploration to fully grasp the magnitude of Christ's sacrifice and why it leads to eternal salvation. Keycap 1. Was Jesus' suffering really temporary? A common misconception is that Jesus' suffering was only a few hours on the cross and therefore less significant than eternal punishment. However, his suffering began long before the crucifixion. In Gethsemane, he was in such deep agony that he sweat blood. Luke 22 verse 44. The betrayal, false accusations, and abandonment by his disciples were deeply painful. His suffering was unique because he bore the sin of the entire world. Isaiah 53 verse 6. His sacrifice was not just physical, it was the weight of every sin ever committed. Keycap 2. Why was Jesus' sacrifice infinitely valuable? Frank mentions that Jesus is both God and man, but why does that matter? A human alone could not pay for the sins of the world. God alone could not die. As God in human form, Jesus could be the perfect, infinite sacrifice. Hebrews 9 verses 26 to 28. The value of a sacrifice depends on who is offering it, and Jesus, being God, offered the most valuable sacrifice possible. This is why his suffering, though in time, had infinite value. It paid for eternity's punishment in one moment on the cross. Keycap 3. Did Jesus experience the equivalent of eternal hell? A deeper question Frank does not explore is whether Jesus endured the full punishment of sin, which would mean taking on the suffering of hell itself. My God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew 27 verse 46. This cry reflects real separation from the Father, which is the essence of hell. The greatest suffering was not the nails, it was the weight of God's wrath. If hell is eternal separation from God, then Jesus took that separation upon himself. In that moment, Jesus took on the full penalty of sin so that we don't have to. Small blue diamond, Jesus' suffering wasn't easy, it was the greatest act of love, absorbing eternal judgment in a finite moment. Small blue diamond, his temporary suffering doesn't mean it was insignificant, it means it was sufficient. Small blue diamond, because he took the punishment, we now have eternal life through faith in him. Romans 6 verse 23. This is why Christianity teaches that salvation is by grace alone, because we could never pay the debt ourselves. Ephesians 2 verses 8 to 9. Books for further study. Open book The Cross of Christ, John Stott, explains why Jesus' suffering was necessary for salvation. Open book Case for Christ, Lee Strobel, investigates historical and theological evidence for Jesus' sacrifice. Open book Knowing God, J.I. Packer, explores the love and justice of God in salvation. Speech balloon. Do you think Jesus' suffering was easy because it was temporary? Let's discuss it below. Backhand index pointing down fire.